Chapter 1 The Problem and its Background. This chapter presents the different essentials, the introduction, which contains the rationale, an explanation of the reasons to the conduct of the research, the review of literature and statistical foundation, the statement of the general and specific problems, the scope and delimitation which identifies the major variables in the indicators, the significance of the study which enumerates the beneficiaries of the study and the corresponding benefits each will receive, and lastly, the notations. Prof. Introduction. This section provides a general overview of what the research is all about. This is a brief discussion of the background, context and research gap of the study. The researcher is expected to discuss the idea, problem, or even that led him or her to the topic he or she is studying, as well as his or her motivations for choosing the study may also be briefly mentioned here. Theoretical framework. This section describes and discusses in the researcher's own words the theoretical or conceptual framework adopted in the study. This is a narrative discussion of the theory adopted by the researcher to guide the study. In the case of conceptual framework, the researcher is expected to discuss and argue the link between the view. The theoretical or conceptual framework can take on different forms. The basis for the hypothesis can be discussed here. When conceptual framework, this is a visual representation intended to facilitate the reader's understanding of the framework. It can take the form of a diagram, flowchart, or other statement of the problem. This is a brief discussion of the purpose of the research, the problem it wishes to address, and the questions that it seeks to answer. This is a brief discussion of the specific issue or concern that the researcher wishes to investigate. This is usually written in a way that presents the particular issue or concern as a research. This is an articulation of the main question and the sub-questions that the researcher intends to answer in their research. There are two problems to state: the major, general or main, problem and the minor, specific, problems or sub-problems. The statement of the problem is the focal point of your research. Specific statements into which the general problem is broken up. Usually, the general problem starts with the phrase, the study, while the sub-problems begin with guidelines in writing the specific problems. Arrange them in a logical order, factual to analytical, following the flow in the research paradigm. State them specifically using grammatically correct language of research without duplicating or overlapping other sub-problems. Provide corresponding statistical tool for each problem requiring such. If applicable, utilize only completely researchable topic, not answerable only by yes or no. Statement of the hypothesis. The research hypothesis is the statement of your assumptions about the prevalence of a phenomenon or about a relationship between two variables that you plan to test within the framework of the study. Hypothesis is required if significant relationship or difference between or among variables is measured. Hypotheses are. Researcher needs to have some points around which the researcher may be oriented in terms of researching for relevant data. 2. They allow us to comprehend on the research project and the motives of the researcher. Hypotheses are neither proved nor disproved. They are tested. Hypotheses have nothing to do with proof, rather, they are a nation of what the facts. Guidelines in stating the hypothesis as states expected relationship between two or more variables as answers to the problems. Utilize testable, specific, and measurable hypothesis. Formulate hypothesis at 0.05 or 0.01 level of significance for decision-making. Scope, limitation, and delimitation of the study. This discusses briefly the parameters of the study. It should explain briefly who what specifically is being studied, the specific aspect being studied, and the period covered by the study. It should explicitly acknowledge any inherent limitations and its implications for the study should indicate the coverage of the study, scope, the weaknesses and shortcomings, limitation, and the variable excluded, delimitation. In writing this section, the first paragraph should contain the scope, the second paragraph should contain the limitation, and the third paragraph should contain the delimitation. Significance of the study. This section provides the practical values the study has, specifically pointing out to whom the study will be most useful, beneficiaries and users, and why the study would be used. Definition of terms. Technical terms and terms which are often used in the study but have different interpretations, or terms that may be misinterpreted, must have to be defined. These terms can be found in the research title, statement of the problem, hypothesis, research paradigm, and some other parts of the study. A term may be defined lexically, authoritatively, published and unpublished materials, or operationally, as used in the study. If the term is lexically or authoritatively defined, the source must. Guidelines in defining terms: use introductory sentence paragraph before defining the terms. Arrange the terms alphabetically, indent, and follow each term with a period. Emphasize the terms to be defined by underlining them. Do not number the terms being defined like 1, 2, 3, and so on. First letter of each term. In case both lexical and operational definitions will be used, write the lexical followed by the operational meanings. Use complete sentences in giving definitions. Chapter 2: Review of related literature and studies. The review of related literature and studies surveys, summarizes, evaluates, and synthesizes studies that are related to or relevant to the thesis dissertation. Overview of the review of related literature and studies. This describes the topics covered and how the review of related literature. Thematic chronological typical discussion of relevant literature. This is the discussion proper of the literature that are related or relevant to the study being conducted. It can be organized chronologically or thematically depending on the literature being conducted. At the minimum, the review of related literature is expected on each of the key concepts of the study. The researcher is expected to evaluate the literature and be conscious of how they relate. Related studies, on the other hand, review of related studies highlights what previous researchers have discovered. This section primarily depends upon how much research has previously been done in the chosen area of investigation. If the area relatively new, the studies reviewed should cite similar areas that lead up to the current realizations. Recommendations. Concluding paragraph of the chapter. At the end of the review of related literature and studies, the researcher is expected to summarize and synthesize what the studies reviewed have said about the research topic. This section should also explicitly mention the gaps in knowledge, questions, or issues that the current literature has so far not been able to address. This can be a strong significance of the study. Synthesis means putting ideas from many sources together in one essay or presentation. After reviewing literature and studies, the task of the researcher in this section is to organize the information around topics, make generalizations, and then present information in a logical way to show both the differences of the reviewed materials in the present study. A synthesis is not a summary, a comparison, or a review. Rather, a synthesis is a result of an integration of what the researcher has read and his ability to use this learning to develop and support a key thesis. Or Chapter 3: Research methodology. This section describes and discusses in detail how the researcher collects and analyzes data in order to answer their research. Locale. This discusses the place or setting of the study. It describes in brief the place where the study is conducted, only important features which have the bearing on the Chapter 3: Research methodology. This section describes and discusses in detail how the researcher collects and analyzes data in order to answer their respondents. Subjects of the study. The respondents are those from whom the data information are to be collected are gathered. The respondents of the study may either be universal total populations or a sample from a population. In a universal total population, all the members of that population are involved. If a sample is taken from a population, these formula may either be Slovin's formula, Parton's formula, Ibb's formula, or the majority rule formula. There are three types of respondents: tryout, target, and actual. Tryout respondents are those people from whom the test instrument is tried out or piloted to. The tryout respondents should not be involved in the actual study. The target are respondents to the finalized validated instrument, although some of them may not be able to respond, accomplish, or return the distributed instrument. The actual respondents are those who actually responded, accomplished, and returned the instrument and where the data from them are used as bases for statistical analysis. Subjects are those who do not respond but are the ones who are data gathering instrument. The instrument to be used must be appropriate to the study, valid, and reliable. In this section of the thesis dissertation, the researcher must indicate how the items in the instrument were formulated. Parts or section of the instrument must be explained, to whom and how it was validated, how it was distributed, and how it was used distributed to the respondents. Data gathering procedure. This describes and discusses the process the researcher intends to undertake to collect data for their research, including the sampling method, the instruments to be used, and the process by which data will be collected. As much as is practically possible, the process should be described step by step in such a way that other researchers can easily statistical treatment of data. The kind of statistical treatment depends upon the nature of the problem, especially the specific problems and the nature of the data gathered. The explicit hypothesis particularly determines the ethical considerations. There are 6 broad ethical areas that need to be considered in your research. In this chapter, we will discuss voluntary participation, informed consent, confidentiality and anonymity, the potential for harm, communicating the results, and Chapter 4 presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data. This is the heart of the research study. It is in this section where the obtained data for sub-problems specific problems are presented, analyzed and interpreted. The data can be presented through the use of tables, text, graphs and figures. Headings consistent problem are presented after the data have already been presented in tabular textual graphical forms, then the data are analyzed and interpreted. Substantially. Elements of the presentation, analysis, and interpretation of data statement of condition or situation, probable cause of condition, probable effect, suggestions for continuance or remedial measure. Chapter 5 Summary, Conclusions, and Recommendations. This chapter presents the summary of the findings, conclusions, and recommendations based on the data analyzed in the previous summary of findings. These are major statements of factual information based on the analyzed data. Only the major and salient findings are included in this portion. All sub-problems must have their respective findings. The result of the hypothesis, if there is any, must be conclusions. These are generalized statements in answer to the sub-problem specific problems raised, or the statement of acceptance or rejection of the hypothesis, if there is conclusion or valid outgrowth of findings, and therefore they are not supported or justified. A one-to-one correspondence with the sub-problem is not always that can be subsumed in one paragraph. Hence, flexibility is considered in making conclusions. Guidelines in writing the conclusions. Generalizations based on findings not to contain numerals. Answering appropriately specific questions formulated concisely, pointing out facts learned from the inquiry, not repetitious of any recommendations. These are drawn from the findings and conclusions of the study. They must be feasible to be implemented, workable or functional, doable, adaptable, and flexible. They may be specific or general or both. A suggestion for further guidelines in writing the recommendations. Solve or help solve problems discovered in the investigation. Be for the continuance of good practice or system. Aim for the ideal, but must be feasible, practical and attainable. Be addressed to persons, entities, agencies that are in a position to implement them. Include recommendation for further research related to the top major findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Enumeration in outline form is used. References. This section lists the books, journal articles, publications, online articles, and other materials the researchers used in the study. The reference list is often organized alphabetically. The formatting can vary depending on the citation style.